Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be playing. Well, I don't know what I'm going to be playing. I guess it depends on whatever you're watching. It's whatever I throw in. This video really isn't about the gameplay. I don't do a whole lot of political commentaries or things like that. I probably will do more once Belugan and I work more on the podcast, which is still being discussed, and some ideas and some progress is being made. It's a little bit slow. He's really busy right now. I'm really busy right now, and we're in the holidays, so definitely something we want to do. But what I wanted to talk about here in this video was I found something interesting last night. I was watching about 4 in the morning Central Time, which is the time zone I'm in. I was watching a speech which Vladimir Putin was giving to the Russian press pool. I don't know. It was a group of journalists, almost like a cross between a State of a Union and a like the press conference dinner, except without the humor. The press conference dinner being in the U.S., where generally the president has a conference with all the media in Washington, and it tends to be more of just kind of joking around, making fun of people, razzing on people, and not too serious, just kind of a good night out. Kind of like that, where all the journalists come together and Putin gives a speech, but much more serious. But what struck me most about the speech that Putin gave, which I suppose shouldn't be too surprising, was his focus on Russia being isolated aggressively by the West. And it's certainly been easy over the last, how many months, almost a year now, to look at Putin's actions in Ukraine and before that in Georgia as, clearly aggressive and clearly not something that most countries consider acceptable today. There certainly is somewhat of a double standard with, superpowers or major powers in the way they treat developing or underdeveloped countries versus, developed countries. But, the idea of a country invading another country in mainland Europe in relatively developed situations, Ukraine isn't Germany, but it's also, not a backwater, not... it's in the heart of Europe, and probably a little too close to Western Europe for people to kind of ignore it. So in that sense, it's largely considered unacceptable, not ignoring the fact that Russia and the United States guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. So, there's treaties in place and whatnot that protect the sovereignty of Ukraine, and there's a lot of reasons that Western countries would kind of freak out about Russia becoming more aggressive and expanding, not to mention the fact that they provide the bulk of gas and oil to European countries. So all of a sudden your gas and oil supplier, who has tons of leverage over you, is going out and doing all these aggressive and kind of unnerving things. And the thing that kind of stuck out to me about the speech that Putin gave was really, I think, how much the West and the East misread each other. Ignoring Ukraine, because that's not so. I'm not debating the issue of Ukraine right now, but I thought it was interesting in Putin's speech multiple times. He came back to the fact that the West has been continually trying to isolate Russia, and certainly recently in the last year or so, I don't think it's been without cause. But the thing that brought the topic up was a question that a journalist asked. Basically, what was it, 25 years ago that the Berlin Wall fell, he asked, and now it seems like there's a new wall going up as a result of the Ukraine crisis. And Putin kind of rejected that notion, claiming that walls have been put up around Russia continuously since the Berlin Wall fell. He basically pointed out that, and granted, I was listening through a translator, so you have to keep that in mind. It's not a literal translation. If you ever really want to fully understand what someone's saying, you really need to learn the language. Unfortunately, I don't know Russian. I don't have time to learn Russian. So with that caveat in there, Putin basically retorted that no, the Berlin Wall may have fallen, but the West never stopped putting up walls against us. I don't think he's exactly correct. I don't think he's correct at all. However, I can see his point, and this is where I'm coming from. When the Berlin Wall fell, some of the quickest, the West didn't dissolve NATO. Obviously the Warsaw Pact, which was Russia's version of NATO, came apart because all those countries fell out of the Soviet bloc. But NATO wasn't dissolved, and NATO at the time was primarily an alliance to counter the Warsaw Pact and to counter Russia. So the Russian Empire more or less falls apart. Russia, in Putin's eyes, comes to the West, willing to work, willing to cooperate, willing to become closer. And the West responds over several years by expanding NATO all the way to the very doorsteps of Russia. NATO expands to Poland. NATO expands to the Baltics, which had been part of Russia for the most part. The Baltic states. They were briefly independent after World War I, before Stalin invaded them and took them over. So they had, 10 years of freedom? No, maybe 20 years of freedom. Between that, they had been continuously occupied by Russia for over 100 years before the war, and, almost 100 years, not 100, but another 70 years after World War II. So they had really not been independent all that much. They'd been part of Russia, and now all of a sudden they're part of NATO. Poland, part of NATO. Rumors and whispers of people wanting Ukraine to join NATO, which I think would be a terrible mistake, but that's a different topic. So, Russia continues to see NATO grow closer and closer to the Russian border. And while NATO has changed a lot since the Cold War, NATO really is no longer an organization solely bent on countering Russia. NATO is now more of a force that operates throughout the world for various reasons, having nothing to do with Russia. But to Russia, that's not the NATO they know. That's not the NATO that's existed for over 50 years as a counter to Russia. So Russia sees this alliance, which was built in response to the USSR, which was built in response to Russia, which was an attempt to help form a cohesive alliance against Russia and block them out of Western Europe. And now it sees it expanding further and further toward its borders, and it sees this as an encroachment upon its borders. So I thought it was interesting when Putin was going on and on about the need for Russia to defend its sovereignty, the need for Russia to have a credible deterrent, and the need for Russia to counter continued Western expansion. And Putin's pushing his narrative. Don't for any minute think that, a lot of the words, I would say almost every word that Putin or any, if you want to call him a dictator, but any strong man in charge chooses their words, if they're intelligent, very, very carefully. And they're very pointed, and most words have a specific meaning. So while he's pushing a narrative about the West being increasingly expansionistic and trying to rally the Russian people against this, because Russia is facing serious challenges because of the sanctions against them, but Putin's trying to use this as a way to unite Russia, in a kind of a patriotic moment, the need to defend the motherland against, Western imperialism. But it's still worth pointing out that while a lot of these statements have motives to them that may not have anything to do with Western expansion, it is a valid way. If you're living in Russia and all of a sudden you see NATO creeping up and creeping up and creeping up and getting closer and getting closer and getting closer, and all these parts that used to be part of Russia, used to be states within Russia, used to be dominated by Russia, the Baltics, Ukraine, Poland was, never part of Russia, but certainly within the Russian sphere of influence for centuries. All these countries are now suddenly joining this alliance, which was founded to counter your country. It's easy to see why you would have that feeling that you're being isolated, and why the West wouldn't be so good-hearted or have positive intentions. What purpose does NATO serve in a post-Soviet world? Is probably the perception that a lot of Russians have. The Warsaw Pact fell, the USSR fell, and NATO expanded, almost like the USSR lost a war and all these territories were traded hands into NATO's hands. And what's the point? If Russia is no longer a threat, why do you need this alliance system? So I can see where he's coming from, and I think it's a difference of kind of perception there. If that's genuine, which to some extent I think it is, it's a different of perception. The West doesn't view NATO as an anti-Russian bloc anymore, at least not until the last year maybe. But Russia still views NATO that way. So I just found that interesting. Maybe rambling on it for 10 minutes wasn't all that insightful, but I think it's important to, understand where different countries approach matters and how it's easy to see things from a different point of view. If you live in Russia, you'd have a very different point of view of NATO, whereas if you live in the West, you probably think it's pretty benign and harmless, and why is Russia freaking the hell out? Well, Russia's fear of being isolated goes back centuries, all the way back to Peter the Great, where Russia felt like it needed a warm water port in order to modernize, in order to be a modern country. Russia has been perpetually afraid of being isolated for hundreds and hundreds of years. And, when your history is about paranoia, about being cut off from the rest of the world, being isolated and being left to wither on a vine, now you see this strong alliance system encroaching upon you while your country's in a financial crisis. It's easy to see how you might feel like oil prices are being manipulated by the West in order to bring you down, and the West is out to get you. It's certainly easy to see how you would spin that tale, accurate or not, which I don't think it is, but I do think it's important to understand where your adversary, where your rival is coming from, and I think that's quite clearly the case. Russia's terrified of being isolated, terrified of being weak, terrified of being cut off from the rest of the world. And when you look through the last 20 years, it's easy to see why they might think that's been NATO's goal, especially when you look at the 100-plus years of history before that, of European expansion and threats into Russia. Germany invades Russia twice in the 20th century. NATO is formed against Russia to seemingly stop Russia from doing, whatever Russia wants to do. And then even before that, France had invaded Russia under Napoleon, and Austria-Hungary and Russia had fought a lot. So Russia's constantly been under threat from Western powers. And, that's one explanation for their drive east during the, the late 1800s and early 1900s, was this desire to break out from Western threats and have new avenues for growth and expansion, and then they get slapped by Japan in early 1900. So in a country the size of Russia, as vast as Russia, it's interesting that there has been this continuous theme of being crushed in and isolated and strangled by outside powers, and you still see that narrative today. Whether we understand it in the West or not is another question. I certainly would hope that, U.S. intelligence, and I'm sure they do, U.S. and European intelligence understand this. Experts on Russia certainly understand this. I'm no genius. And, our governments understand this, but, the people that they speak to, the people that they campaign to, probably don't. And it was just something interesting that I felt like rambling about for 13 minutes. So hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, I won't do a whole lot of this type of stuff. I just probably could have thought it out better. But anyway, it's just me rambling for 15 minutes about my thoughts. So, yeah, I appreciate you tuning in. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.